We welcome you. We're glad you're here, especially since Earth Week and the goodness of our Earth are really on our minds this week. So, and we will have a nice discussion and then we'll have questions at the end. I'm Betsy Sloan. I'm a member of the Adult Ed Committee. This is Becky Mara, who's also a member. And just briefly, I've been a member for about 15 years. And I live in Evanston, and I'm a freelance writer. That's 1 minute on me.
Oh, I didn't know we were going to do that. So I've been a member since I don't know when. Used to sing in the choirs, and
great. Yeah, that's fine. Can you tell about classes?
Travel on mission trips.
Oh yeah,
That's
a lot of mission trips. I've been on all of the mission trips. So.
Wow, nice.
Yeah. So those have been a joy. Wanted to let you know about the next upcoming adult ed event, which is the First Tuesday Book Club on May 3rd. It's a discussion that's led by Nanette Sawyer, and it's about how to fight anti-Semitism, a book by Barry Weiss, and that'll be online.
Okay, and now I'd like to introduce Amy, who has been a member for
Oh gosh, well I was, before I became a pastor, I was a member for about a dozen years. So that was starting in like 1998 or so. So it's been a while, yeah.
Amy Pagliaro is the book review editor for the Presbyterian Outlook, which is a magazine for church leaders. She first taught the ministry as a Hereford, and has since served Presbyterian churches in Glen Forest, Edgewater, and Lincoln Park. She feels fortunate to work in a role where she's either reading new books, writing about them, or recruiting others to participate. That does sound like good.
It's a treat.
She and her family worship at Fort Trust, and she enjoys voluntary confirmation. She is today.
Yes.
So thank you.
So I'd like to open us in prayer. Dear Lord, thank you for bringing us together this morning. Be with us as we learn how taking care of our precious planet is not just a responsibility as your children, but a way and a path to draw us closer to you. In your name we pray.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you so much to both of you, and thank you to the Adult Ed Committee for giving me a chance to do this. I have to say I feel incredibly fortunate. The last time I was able to share this content with people, I usually do it as more of a retreat. And the last couple years haven't been very conducive to retreats. So I am really feeling grateful to be back with a group of people eager to learn and to talk and to enjoy our time together. I do have access to a microphone, and if you're having a hard time hearing me, just raise your hand and I'll flip it on. But otherwise, I like to move around a little bit, so I'm just going to try to project my voice. But please don't be shy to raise your hand. Similarly, we're going to have some opportunities to turn to the person next to us and have a little conversation. But if you have a question, you can feel free, if it's really urgent, to ask it as we go. But then at the very end, if we have folks on Zoom or in the room who want to ask questions, by all means, we'll leave some time for that. So I want us to start to think here by hearing some words of Jesus. Jesus said, "Are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me. Get away with me, and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly." So freely and lightly, those are words that I want us to sit with for a little while. This comes from the Gospel of Matthew, but it's a translation that you may not be as familiar with by Eugene Peterson. But sometimes his words are just accessible Oh, do we need to turn off? Oh, that's okay. That's okay. Thank you. Sometimes his words make it a little bit more accessible. So this idea of living freely and lightly is what I want us to sit with. And to that end, we're going to think about a place or a space or a time in our lives when we're able to live freely and lightly. You might think of a place where you feel most alive, where you feel joyful, where you are just, relaxed and so happy. And I want you to take a minute and think of that. And then I'm going to invite you to turn to the person next to you and share that. And if at any time when I ask you to turn to the person next to you, if that feels uncomfortable for you, you can feel free to just journal it for yourself or whatever is most comfortable. So think of that place where you feel most alive, and then share that with the person next to you. Does anybody want to briefly share what was the place that they discussed? Was it nature? Was it the city? Was it a particular place or a general place? Betsy?
Mine was this particular beach in an area called Topsail, Topsail Beach, North Carolina.
Nice.
Because it's beautiful and it's never that crowded.
Okay.
Just can spend the whole day there.
I love it. That's your place. I love it. Anybody else?
Carol and I started having, although different genres, and we started the idea of being by yourself.
Interesting. Yeah, so being alone for you is restorative. You feel like it's life-giving for you. Yeah? Craig, can I impose on you to share? Because I love it.
Because the diametric opposite of what everybody else has been saying.
Yeah.
Exactly what I said to Amy. We moved here from New York City and I can't wait to get back.
Yeah. Yeah, so for some people, it's the place where you feel the bustle, and,
Yeah.
right? Where that you feel most alive. So I love that we had some very, some different experiences, right? But for all of us, there's that place where we feel fully alive. And the reason I like to start with this is because sometimes when we talk about the environment, it feels a little doom and gloom, right? Let's just put that out there. It can be discouraging. It can be overwhelming to think about. But what I like to start with is to remember, why is this important to us? Why do we care so deeply? After all, we're only going to have, max maybe 100 years on this earth, right? So why do we care so deeply about this environment? And I think it's because we remember the places that are important to us. And we remember the places where we feel most alive. And one time when I did this at a retreat, and we were with this, when we were talking, I was talking with a group of women, and as we kind of went along and we started thinking, what were the commitments to the environment that we wanted to make? One of the women said, well, my commitment is to get out and take more walks. And I'm not going to lie, I was a little disappointed because I thought, oh, but I've shared so much material with you. Don't you want to do something, big and grandiose? And she said, I feel like if I'm going to have the energy to call my congressperson or to not buy something that I want to buy, or if I'm going to make major changes in my life, I need to be reminded of why this is important and what I'm fighting for. And so for her, it was as simple as making sure to get out more and enjoy this earth that God has given us. So we're going to keep that in the back of our minds and come back to it whenever we want to kind of remind ourselves why we are here having this conversation. I also like us to start with that because this class is about the environment, sustainability, caring for the earth, but it's also about that's not just something that's political or something that's practical, but for Christians, it's something, and for people of I would argue all faiths, it's something that's deeply spiritual. And so we're also in this time together going to talk about how our care for the earth can be a spiritual practice. And that could be something as simple as, for example, in our family, we compost. Composting is stinky and gross. It is not a joy, right? So, but when I'm composting or when I'm getting my children to compost, as opposed to thinking of it as a stinky chore, to think of it as oh, what is this wonderful God-given opportunity that we have to give back to the earth, that which was once living and is now going to be returned to this beautiful, deep, dark topsoil as opposed to, the landfill, right? So that's an example of taking something very basic and turning it into a spiritual practice. And that's, I think, one of the ideas of spiritual practices are that anything can be a spiritual practice. As Barbara Brown Taylor says, anything that is done with intention can be. And so you might think that a spiritual practice is just like, praying or going to church, and absolutely those are spiritual practices. However, it doesn't have to be that formal. We can take anything from a daily walk, from the compost bin, from calling our congresspeople, to being in a protest, to conserving water in the shower. Any of these can be spiritual practices. So that's also the framework I want us to have as we go in. And then you shared with one another and with all of us these places where we feel fully alive. And I would argue that that is also part of feeling fully alive, is experiencing God, right? So we might not say when we go walk down the streets in Midtown, or when we go to a beach, we might not explicitly say, I'm going there to meet God. But when we are in that happy place, when we are in that place where we feel just right, that might be one of the best places for us to experience God's presence. And so I want us to realize that this is not going to be a time of doom and gloom. This is going to be a time of joy, a time of learning, I hope, but also a time of realizing how we can very immediately and practically apply what we're discussing here into just feeling more of God's presence in our lives as we take care of God's green earth. And so I'm just going to give you a real quick overview of what the next 4 weeks will look like. I want you to know each week is a standalone, so if you can't come next week, come the week after. That would be fantastic. If you want to go tell your friends to come, they don't need to worry that they missed today. But we are going to start today with a little bit of Bible study and a little bit of understanding how this is part of our faith as Christians. And then we're going to start getting a little bit more into the nitty-gritty of what are the guiding principles of caring for the environment, and what are some practical things that we can do. And at the same time, we're going to infuse that with some spirituality, right? So when we're doing something practical, how can it be spiritually nourishing at the same time? And then we're going to get very practical, but also very big picture as we think about things like how do we make changes in our daily life, and how do we make changes in our community through advocacy and justice and the things that maybe now we don't feel quite so comfortable doing, but I really hope through our conversation we'll get there. So before I kind of dive in, any questions, comments? Awesome. Then let's go back to the beginning. So I want us to start, we've got this gorgeous picture here of the earth. And the reason I start with this is because I heard an interview a number of years ago with an astronaut. Very few of us are going to have the opportunity in our lifetimes to see the earth from this perspective, but this astronaut did. And as she sat many miles away from Earth and she saw the globe and the shape of the earth, it hit her for the first time. And she said, when we talk about saving the earth, we don't really mean saving the earth. That earth is always going to be there. What we mean is saving it for humanity, saving it to be inhabitable by us. And so that is, that for her, gave her just that added push to say, this is what we need to be about. Now, that astronaut actually was the first African-American woman to go into space. Her name is Mae Jemison. And she has really, since she has had that experience, she's really made a core part of her work to be sustaining the environment. And when I heard this story, it actually reminded me of the Bible. it reminded me of Genesis 1 and going back to the beginning. And we're going to, like I said, we're going to do a little bit of Bible study here. But I want us to start. Can you help remind me? Genesis 1 opens with a story of creation. And it starts with in the beginning or in a beginning. And it goes on. Do you remember what some of the first things were that God created? You can just shout them out. God created heaven and earth. Yes, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth, and it was good. What else?
Dry land and water.
Yes, I didn't hear the first part.
Dry land.
Dry land, there we go. Yeah, dry land and water, right? God separated the waters from the sky, and that was good. Anything else that God created in the beginning?
Day and night.
Day and night, yes. Light, right? Let there be light, and it was good, and there was day and night. So we remember all of these parts of the creation. But when I started to think about it from an environmental perspective, it was the first time I realized, you know, there's a lot of creation going on before we get to human beings, right? Human beings are not created until day 6. And so we have to remind ourselves that this human-centric view of creation that we have is because we're the ones telling the story, right? We're the ones who wrote it down. If the story was being told by kale or pandas or fish or birds or anything else, the story might look a lot different. And so we put that lens on when we read the story, right? We put the lens on of human beings. And so as we continue in the story, we get language like this, where it said that, after God made human beings, God blessed them and said to them, "Be fertile and multiply. Take the earth and master it. Take charge of the fish of the sea, the birds in the sky, and everything crawling." So this is one of these passages that has kind of guided the way that we understand our role as humans in engaging with the rest of creation. And this is from one of the more recent translations of the Bible, from one just a few years ago. But what's interesting here is even though there's that language of mastery, it still says, to take charge of, but there's a little bit of nuance in that word that we might not quite see in the English. It comes in the Hebrew, it's from this word we'ardu, which means to rule, right? And so a ruler can be a good ruler or a bad ruler. Can be a benevolent ruler or an oppressive ruler, right? So there's nothing explicitly here that says like, okay, humans, you're the ones who need to be in charge. However, we have a lot of us who maybe even grew up with or have kind of the remnants of earlier translations of the Bible. And so here I have the King James Version. So this, and this was the Bible that really dominated for, almost 400 years. And here it says, "And God blessed them, and God said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply, replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth." And so I think because that is the translation that was most common for so long, it really does, it's very human-centric, and it's led to comments like this. Now please realize I'm not putting this comment up because it's a mainstream point of view. It comes from an End Times website, so it's from a very particular point of view. But it's indicative of some of the language that we inherited from this. Where their interpretation is that God gave man dominion to rule over all of the earth. God was created to rule with the same authority that God rules over all things. So the understanding that many humans have had is that we were created to really take charge of all of creation and kind of have dominion, might say, to sort of bend it to our will. And so I'm not going to say that that's completely untrue, but to help us understand the context for why the nuances there might not be what was particularly intended, I want us to think a little bit of the context in which the Bible was written, in the context of Genesis in particular. So this was written in an agricultural society to people who lived in the desert, right? Not completely in the desert, but surrounded by a lot of desert, right? And so these people were farmers. Anybody here garden, or have you ever gardened? Done a little bit? So you know, like when you garden, I mean, gardening is awesome. I love gardening, right? But it's not always a piece of cake. If you were to try to feed your entire family from what you gardened, would that be an easy task, or would that be some hard work? Probably be some hard work, right? I mean, just the weeding alone. And so imagine if you've ever seen, like in your garden, buckthorn, or you've ever had like an invasive species, you've ever had just plain old weeds, right? You know how hard it is to eke out a living from the land. And so, you know, the people who are writing down these stories and the stories of Genesis are experiencing that firsthand. And so they're realizing the idea of subduing the earth. You kind of need to do a certain amount of that, or you're not going to be able to live. You're not going to be able to feed your family. And so it's a very different world. It's not as though the person, the writers of Genesis were saying, okay, humans, build, you know, roads and fly planes and get, you know, Amazon vehicles and FedEx vehicles and UPS vehicles to deliver everything that you need, right? They were speaking to people in a very liminal time where it was hard work to take care of the earth. So it's a very different, a different world than what we are used to. Oops, hang on here. Oh, there it goes. Now it's moving. All right. So that's the first part of the creation story. Sometimes we like to say there are actually two creation stories in the Bible. There's Genesis 1, Genesis 2. Two different views of creation written at two different periods of time. But the second creation story, humanity has a much bigger role. In the second creation story, there isn't all this grand backdrop of the creation of everything else. It really truly starts with the creation of humans. And so here we're going to dive a little bit into the language. In Genesis 2, it says, "The Lord God took the human and settled them in the Garden of Eden to farm it and to take care of it." So there's language here that we can really draw on, I think, if we want to really challenge that idea that we're supposed to have dominion over the earth. We can draw on Genesis 2. And so to do that, it's a little bit fun just to kind of dig into some of what's going on here. But this starts with, you know, there was no human being to farm the fertile land. So it acknowledges the land is there. Someone needs to farm it and take care of it, right? And so what does God do? God gets down in the dirt, gets down in the topsoil, the Adamah, and from that draws out a human being, the Adam, right? First human. And so the idea is that humans were literally created out of this great rich topsoil. And so it's a wonderful image for us to recapture if we're thinking about just the importance of caring, not just for the earth big picture, but like caring for the dirt, like nitty-gritty level of care, is that humans literally came out of this rich topsoil. And so again, the people reading this story or hearing this story, they're farmers. They get their hands dirty. They know what this is like. So this is something that would speak to them, right? And then there are these two particular words that are translated. And this word farm, it comes from levadah in the Hebrew, and it means not just to farm, but also to cultivate, to work, or to serve, right? So if the idea here is that human beings weren't created until the land was already created, and then we were put there to serve, to take care of. Again, very different than having dominion over. And then the second word that's translated here as to take care of, this word is olshamera, and it means not just to take care of, but also to keep or to preserve. right? So if we want to kind of recapture our biblical roots, this is something that we can look to say, hey, wait a second. Turns out that this is a core part of what we were put on this earth to do, is to care for it. I know I threw a little bit of Hebrew and stuff in there, so any questions before we keep moving along?
That's the same verb, the both of them?
No, they're two different verbs, actually. So the first one is farm, and the second is to take care of. And yeah, farm, again, like when somebody translates, they're always making a best, I won't say guess, but they're making their best decision. And so this word of farm, they could have translated as work, cultivate, or serve. They all share the same root. But yeah, two different words. Yeah, so I mean, I don't know. I love this stuff, right? It's really exciting when you kind of dig in there just to see, oh my goodness, this was part of it from the beginning, right? And then there was another part. So this is Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. And then you may recall we've got some other good stuff that happens. Noah and the ark. The earth destroyed. That's a conversation for another day because that is also troubling. But after Noah and his family and the animals come out of the ark, God says to them, I am establishing my covenant with you, Noah, God is speaking to Noah, and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the domestic animals, and every animal of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. So again, here's another example of where humans are telling the story. So I always grew up with the idea that the covenant that God made was specifically with Noah, and by extension, Noah's children, wife, descendants, etc. But the covenant's with every living creature, right? So again, this covenant that is so important isn't just with humans. It's God making a promise to all of creation, to all the four-legged creatures and the birds and the fish and all of them, saying, you are a part of my promise to maintain and to care for you. So when I look at that, I say, I don't think caring for the earth is just nice to do. I think it's actually a core part of who we are as Christians and who we are as people of faith. And so it's, we're working alongside our friends in all the other major world religions to say we need to make some changes in the way that we and our world operate to live more freely and lightly, because this is what God has called us to do. I'm saying that, but others are saying it too. And I came across just the other day, John Bell. This one's a little tricky to read, so I'll read it in just a second. But you may know of John Bell. He is from the Iona community in Scotland. Brilliant, lovely human being, international church worship leader. And he says, I am suggesting that ecology should be part of our faith witness to those who come after us. Young people who are increasingly vocal about the toxic legacy they are inheriting should not come at this solely through Greenpeace or Friends of the Earth. If they have anything to do with the Christian faith, they should discover that we worship a God who loves the world. And unless we love it too, our discipleship will be partial. And so what I love about that is, he's not denigrating Greenpeace or Friends of the Earth at all, but he's saying that, if we look at the church and we look at young people who in some cases feel disconnected from the church, what's one thing that a lot of young people are really passionate about? It's caring for the environment. And we, as within spiritual circles, but also within government circles, we've started to call this intergenerational justice, right? The idea that if we don't take care of the planet, we're basically stealing it from future generations. And so as we, not only do we owe it to those young people, those confirmands and those kiddos and the children not yet born, not only do we owe it to them to take good care of the environment for them, but what a wonderful way to engage more people in the life of the church. By saying we care about what you care about, we feel really called to do it. We're going to do it boldly and joyfully. Why don't you come join us, right? It's just a wonderful opportunity, I think, for the church. And so I think when we start to look at it that way, I want us to think in the next few weeks about what does it mean if earth keeping is essential to our call, right? It can be something that we do privately. It can be something that we do corporately, and that can be like within our communities, or it can be here in the church. I know the youth are going to be going next, the youth went just yesterday down to another church, Second Presbyterian Church, to plant flowers and a tree, with other youth, right? So it's a way that this can be part of our communal life as well. And then it's also something that we do as citizens and as a way of serving in our communities. And one time when I was sharing this in a retreat format, and I was with a group of women, and when I got to like the end of the first night, there was a woman who was getting very frustrated, and she said, you're talking so much about like these little personal private things that we should do, like bring your own bag or compost or whatever. And she's like, that's all well and good, but that's not going to change the world, right? We need to change the world by, eliminating fossil fuels, by, green energy, by all of these, different major things. And I started talking to her, and it turned out she was not just talking the talk, she was walking the walk. She had been out with Jane Fonda, and they'd gotten arrested doing protests. She was doing, I'm not going to slam Amazon all the time, but I am lifting it up as this was one example of something that she had been involved in communities, trying to put regulation on. She was doing a lot of wonderful things. And I was like, I assured her we will get to that, but we kind of take a little trajectory. When we got to that, I invited her to get up and talk because she knew more than I did, and it was wonderful to hear that. So I think that I lift that up now early to let you know that we have a lot of flexibility over the next few Sundays in terms of how we spend our time. And so if there's somebody here who's like, hey, I'm all in and I'm going to be back next Sunday, and I would like us to do a little bit more focus on a particular piece of earth keeping, I am very much open to that. And I love that. That would be super exciting because there is, there's so much that we could do here. I think whatever we do, we need to find a new way to engage with others about our changing climate. There's a wonderful new book out called Saving Us. Catherine Hayhoe is the author, and she is a Christian. And she is also a climate scientist. And so she shares how, in her work as a scientist, she's very data driven. That's the nature of the work. And so she, does all the research and she comes back with the facts. And then she gets hit by trolls and, people who are just angry at her and call her unmentionable names and things like that. And so what she has concluded is, this conversation that we're having needs to be a broad conversation. It doesn't need to be a conversation with 100% of people. She says there are about 7% of people who are not only not interested in the facts, but are just, to them, it's such a badge of honor to say climate change is not real that you're unlikely to persuade that 7%. But the good news is the other 93% are all on a spectrum, right? And so there are some people who believe that climate change is real, but they don't know what to do about it. Or they hear things that we should do about it, but those things are scary because it implies that we need to completely give up the way of life that some have come to know and love, and that is going to be more than they can possibly tackle, and so it's much easier to deny than it is to try to figure out how do I engage with this topic. And so what Catherine Hayhoe says is when we have these conversations, start with something that we have in common. Start with something that we value personally, and then we can connect it to why climate change matters to us personally, right? And so again, I want us to think about that place where we feel most alive. That's a way into a conversation with someone. And so if someone here is, if any of you are feeling a little bit like this is not what I was looking for, I'm not comfortable with this, or if you go out and you're chatting with people over brunch and telling them how much fun you had at church today, as we imagined together what it will be like for Christians to answer the call to save the world for humanity, that starting with what we have in common and what we value is the easiest way into some more difficult conversations. And then we are gonna, though, tackle some of these difficult conversations. And so I wanna give you just a little taste of what those are going to be. There are many different rubrics for how we can look at this, but these are some of the things that I find useful. We'll talk about the things that we're already doing and the things that we can do differently around the ideas of loving nature, simple living, celebrating God's abundance, food, right? Food is a big part of our lives, so how can we be mindful, not by necessarily completely changing the way that we eat, but by being mindful. Gratitude, as opposed to being consumers, we can be stewards who live with gratitude. It's a different way of viewing our world as humans, and keeping the Sabbath. And that I don't necessarily mean that in some of the ways that you might have been told keeping the Sabbath, but in a way of trying to live more freely and lightly. And then other ways, I'll give everybody my email before we're finished today, so that if you have ideas for how you'd like to tackle this, that's something that we make sure we have time for. So what I'd love for us to do is, first I'm gonna take a couple minutes for if there are any questions, and then we're gonna pair up again for just a brief conversation. Are there any questions that you have for me? Yeah, please, Betsy.
So for example, when you said we could email you things, I live alone, but I would love to compost, but I don't know how to do it really. I don't know how to get started.
Yeah.
So I'd like to maybe talk about that a little bit.
That's great. So that's something I'll come prepared to talk about. But yeah, great. Do we have people on Zoom or?
I think there may be an issue with the link or something.
Okay.
I think they're on the app communicating.
Got it. Well, just in case there are folks on Zoom who are hearing, I understand they might not be able to hear the questions. Yeah, maybe put that in the chat. So we'll talk about the the nitty-gritty of composting. But also, Betsy, that's a great example of if you some of these are going to be easier tasks for some people, depending. I have kids. When I did this, I did this once in a retreat. There were a lot of people with children who were talking about how hard it can be with kids, right? Because not only do kids there's a lot of gear and stuff for kids these days, but things like kids don't always like to do things that are countercultural. And so she was sharing how hard it is when you're the snack parent and all the kids want, Gatorade and plastic bottles, and they want individually wrapped, I don't know, fruit gummy snacks or, whatever. And I was like, yeah, it's hard, isn't it? And she was like looking to me for the answer. And I said, well, I bring I'm that parent. I bring like clementines, and then I'm like, I'll compost them, give me your peels. And I bring a big thing of water to refill everybody's water bottles. And she kept like kind of pushing me, and I left feeling really bummed that I didn't have the right answer for her. And then like 2 weeks later, I was like, oh wait, I did have the answer. The answer was it stinks that you have to be the one to say to your kids, I know that it's popular to have Gatorade, but my mom doesn't want to bring plastic bottles, so we're not going to do it. But that's a lesson for them too, right? And it might be a little bit embarrassing in the short term, but what a better opportunity to share values with the kids. And so instead of thinking I didn't have an answer, I thought I just had an unpopular answer, but I did have an answer. So there are there are things like that about some things are going to be harder for parents, some things are going to be harder for people who live alone, but this is one of the beautiful things about living in community, right? It's maybe something you can't tackle on your own, you can tackle with your building or your neighbors or with those of us in the room here. So yeah, we'll talk composting for sure. Okay. Awesome. Any other questions or thoughts along those lines? Yeah, please.
I was thinking this, and this is kind of a basis for understanding your faith as well as understanding yours. When you make changes, it costs you something. And that's a very hard concept to get across to kids and adults.
Yeah.
And we were working on that on a pilgrimage to Iona. And I remember this example, which isn't a great example, but I remember this one, that we had someone who liked to sleep in, and we started every morning at 8. And near the end of the time, she was there at 7:45. So people were sort of razzing her in that. But I remember the leader said, "So what did this cost you in order to do that?" And that's how I think of, well, I've had gardens. I've been very frustrated. I have to have a fence for the rabbits. Everything is hard work. The compost pile in particular, I find hard. And it's not my land, but if it were, I would have a much nicer compost pile. And so I have a lot of trouble with it because it has slats. So the chipmunks go in there and drag stuff out on the driveway. Irritating. And that's just a simple example of this.
Yeah. So first off, I love the example that you gave from your pilgrimage to Iona. Yeah, so the reality here is, right, everything does have a cost, right? And so what I find is important is for us to sort of balance, like the story I just shared about, you said it's hard to tell a kid, right? The story I just shared about a parent with a child, that costs something, right? So the hope is to sort of get that parent on board with thinking, okay, there's a cost, but there's a benefit that's so much greater, right? And it's the benefit of raising children who value the earth and who value sustainability and who don't want to spend a lot of money on individually packaged snacks when they could, provide healthy, cheaper clementines and water for free, that's an example. And I would assume in the Iona example, I don't know, what did they say? What was it that it cost them, or what helped them make that shift?
Well, everybody has their own basic schedule, I guess,
yeah.
and all that. So, that person brought that up. But I was thinking also about what other people think. With kids, that's just paramount. If their lunch doesn't look like the next lunch, it bothers them.
Right.
And so if you have like containers that you can use again, for instance. Plastic, as you know, is one of our biggest offenders. Many of the grocery stores still use it. And so those are hard conversations, and you're going to take some flack about that.
Yeah. So I think that's a good reminder. So this isn't free, right? There will be times that I don't do bottled water. I bring a water bottle. There are times I've forgotten my water bottle. I am really thirsty. It is uncomfortable. I do not wish to be thirsty, right? And so in that moment, that's for me becomes a spiritual practice. I am choosing to deprive myself of bottled water until I can get to a drinking fountain or I can get home. And I'll bring my props in weeks to come, but I also carry a little collapsible cup with me now, because I've learned, right? The first time it really was lousy to be so thirsty, and then I learned, oh, bring a little collapsible cup, and then I don't have to worry about it. So we're gonna talk about some of the practical things that we can do to balance it out. We're also gonna talk, one time when I did this retreat, it was right before Lent, and so it was perfect because we said, what can you fast from during Lent? But we don't have to wait for next year's Lent to make a choice, right? We can choose to do something differently just for the next week or the next 2 weeks. And then we can, at the end of that, we have a personal experience of like, what are the costs? Are those costs worth it, right? And is there a way I can put it in the bigger picture? And then what we can also do is then, well, if we start by changing ourselves, can that lead to communal change? So I serve on a group with the Presbytery. A few years ago, we started having lunch brought in. And I was just really astonished by how much waste was generated by that lunch. And I said to the group, hey, what if we started bringing our own utensils and maybe even our own plates? And then I'll bring compostable plates. So anybody who forgets their plates, you know, I'll bring them home and I'll compost them. And some of the looks were not good. Like there was one woman, I will go to my grave remembering the look on her face, like, oh, for goodness sakes. But you know what, the next month, everybody brought their own utensils. And some of them were super excited, like, oh, I found this at the rummage sale. Look, it's a cute little, you know, a little caddy of my, you know, utensils. And people like kind of got on board. And so I went from being like the annoying that person, right, to other people being like, hey, we gave it a try and that wasn't so bad. Right? And so maybe then they'll go to other places in their lives and say, hey, what if we do this for the work lunch or the school lunch or whatever, you know? So yeah, there are ways that we can sometimes just bear the cost, and there are ways that we can try to reduce the cost by some of the tricks that we'll kind of share with each other as we progress.
Also, the pandemic was really hard on this
Yes.
factor. Example, my chorus meets in Buchanan Chapel. No water in the whole place. So then you go across the street to Starbucks and you're going to have plastic, you know. And so, yes, you can change it after that day, but it's still hard for me to remember on Mondays.
Yes.
And it's hard for me. Imagine having 4 or 5 kids.
Yes.
Oh my God, it's a nightmare.
Yeah.
I've been a nanny, and I can't tell you. I only have 2 kids. I was raised after the first 2 days.
Well, I hear you. I hear you, and I assure you, we're going to tackle some of that. Did I see that your hand was going up there? Yeah.
The size of the problem is very daunting, and I don't know what we can do about it. It seems it's worldwide. It's been part of our lifestyle, and we need strategies for breaking things down and seeing progress. I think, in each of our lives.
For sure. And what we're going to talk about, I absolutely agree with you, and I'd love to hear more if this isn't going to get at what you're looking for. But I think that kind of goes to the idea that, like, I think making personal and incremental changes are really important because we can only control ourselves. We can't control the government. We can't control other countries, right? But we also need to figure out how to use our power as consumers, our power as investors, our power as Presbyterians. We're not the United Nations in terms of our power, but we'll be talking about at the upcoming General Assembly, which is coming up in June. There are going to be some things on the table around divesting from fossil fuels, and so we'll talk through what does that look like, and depending on how you feel about that, that might be something that you say, well, I can't control what the U.S. government does, but I can control where I personally invest my money, and I can control the amount of pressure that I choose to put on my local leaders, my state leaders, and my national leaders. And so we'll definitely talk about advocacy because that is really important. Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? Well, I'm going to ask us to kind of close our time by, we've talked about a lot of different things, and like I said, I'm going to be taking some input from you about what we want to focus on in the next few weeks. But I'd love for everyone to think, let me scoot up here for just a second, to turn with your neighbor, or if you prefer, to reflect on your own about what does a spiritual practice mean to you? And is there something that you currently do to care for the earth, or something that you would like to do to care for the earth that you want to just try right away? That you're just like all in for, whether it's carrying your water bottle or calling your congressperson or whatever it is. Think about what you'd like to try right away. And if there's nothing that you'd like to try right away, that's great too. It's all good. But if you could just, we're going to close by turning to the person next to us and having that quick conversation. I'm going to wrap us up, and then we can continue our conversations if we would like. But I'd love for us to, can you all see this, or do you need to come a little closer? It's a little small, but I would love for us to close with this prayer. And I'm going to ask this side of the room to do the italics, and this side of the room to do the boldface. Does that make sense to everybody? All right, fantastic. All right, italicized folks. The end is God's. The beginning is God's.
The storm is God's, the peace is God's.
The depths are God's, the heights are God's.
The dark is God's, the light is God's.
For all times, all things, and all belong to God.
Travel with God to the end from the beginning.
Walk with the one who offers us salvation.
Continue with God during storm as well as with peace.
Walk with the God of your deliverance.
Journey with God through the depths and the heights.
Walk with the light of your restoration.
Journey with God in the dark and the light.
Walk with the God of your assurance.
For all times and all things belong to God.
Amen. Go in peace. Thank you, everyone. I'll stick around. I'll stick around for questions and everything. And you can keep conversations going or hit the road. It's all good.